For part two of this, I think I'm going to talk about the races. That's probably the most visible change when trying to make Eberron fit into my system. And I called my system Dark Heritage because that was the name of the setting that I designed years and years ago. It's actually had a lot of evolution, and in some ways the name of the setting is not as relevant as when I first started it, but it's stuck. I already named my blog after it. I couldn't really change it very easily, so it is what it is. So if I'm trying to change Eberron to fit into Dark Heritage, which has different races, some of them, how am I going to do that? And that's what I want to talk about now. Let me first go through what the races are that Dark Heritage has and explain them very briefly. First off, it's got humans. This is again, Dark Heritage is very much a D&D influenced fantasy setting, so it's not going to be something totally off the wall, but it does have some differences. So the first off, we have humans. Everybody knows what a human is because we all are one, right? The next group is called the Skraelings. These are some indigenous people who were on Corvair when humans arrived. Humans came. Let me back up just a little bit. Again, one of my guiding principles was that Eberron Remixed will be much more humanocentric than Eberron, which means that there will be a lot more humans relative to the other races. The other races will be relatively more rare and more exotic. In Eberron as printed, humans came from Sarlona and spread across the continent from a beachhead on the far eastern shores, up kind of now in what are now the Lazar Principalities. In Eberron Remixed, this did happen. However, there were another completely different race of humans who are already here. And so the humans that we see now are varying degrees of a mixture of these two ancient ancestral stocks of humans. The ones that came from Sarlona will tend to be, or if you have more genetics from Sarlona, you will tend to be taller, more Nordic in appearance, fairer skin, lighter colored eyes, lighter colored hair. If you are one of the ones who are here already, you will tend to have a more Mediterranean appearance. Bronzer, darker skin, darker hair, brown eyes. It's should be very familiar to people from Europe. You've got kind of the northern group, represented by people like the Swedish or the British or the Germans mostly, and you got the southern group represented by people like the Greeks or the Spaniards or the Italians. And in between, you've got various degrees of admixture. And in real life, this came from what were basically two, actually three, very ancient ancestral stocks during the Neolithic or earliest Bronze Age before recorded history. And we can tell from genetics that Europe was basically peopled by three different ancient ancestral stocks that kind of mixed and became the modern European nations. This is exactly what happened on Corvair, except instead of three, there's two. And because they landed on Corvair kind of in the northeast, that tends to be where the Sarlonan genetic profile is strongest. If they moved along the north, which was much lower populated, then they also kind of maintained their Sarlonan genetics more strongly. But as they moved further south and further west, they came across where established populations there were more people, they were thicker, and there were more of them. So the genetic signal from Sarlona, gradually fades mostly. And of course, there's pockets where things move up in and about. What this means is that the Karns, for example, will be, blonder, taller. They'll look kind of like the, northern Russians, and the Brelandish people will be more like the Italians in physical appearance. That's all very, very broad and high level, though. The next group after human is the Skraelings. Like I said, they are people who are here on Corvair They're similar to humans, but they're not quite humans. And they are actually the descendants of stranded Atlanteans who were on the continent for whatever reason when Atlantis had its disaster and sank under the waves. So they're stranded Atlanteans. They have become very savage and primitive. It's likely that many of them were actually slaves at the time Atlantis sank, or convicts, or some other, out of favor, rebels maybe, renegades, which is why they weren't on Atlantis in the first place. But Atlantis is a very cursed place, and everything associated with it is cursed as well. The Skraelings are kind of very Stone Age in their technology, and actually they're cursed in the sense that they cannot possess or use metal for extended lengths of time. Physically, they look like what some interpretations of the Western hunter-gatherer population would have looked like. So if you look up images of Labranya man or Loshboar man, they have very wide faces. They're almost Neanderthal-like in some ways. They have very wide faces, heavy cheekbones, sloping foreheads, brownish, nut brown skin, but bright blue eyes, and kind of darker brown to black hair. You could be forgiven for thinking that they are human, and in fact there are people who claim that they're just an exotic population of humans. Except that there are some notable differences between them. In particular, like I said, the curse that prohibits them from doing very much with metal, and they have different stats. So that's the next race, and I like the idea. This deck actually does kind of cater to the concept of dark heritage. Most of the races that are not human are demi-humans of some sort or another. By which I mean demi-human not in the way that Gary Gygax used it. He seemed to use demi-human to mean simply a non-human who had good PR and was photogenic, like elves or dwarves or halflings, for example. Well, they look kind of like humans and they're friendly to humans, therefore they're demi-humans. Why aren't orcs demi-humans? Well, because they're unfriendly and they're ugly and people don't like them, so they become monstrous humanoids. To me, a demi-human is kind of more along the lines of how the Greeks would have used demi-human or demigod. Demi-humans are people who are genetically and physically very similar to humans, but they are obviously touched by some kind of exotic ancestry somewhere in their past that gives them an exotic look and different racial stats, and maybe something else along with it too. Most of these supernatural influences, and they are often going to be supernatural, are dark. Therefore, the title Dark Heritage actually does still work, even though it's migrated significantly away from what I meant when I initially coined that term. So the Skraelings qualify. They look like humans, but they are touched by the curse of Atlantis. The next race I have is orcs, and then I also have goblins. These are the exceptions to what I just said. They are just simply non-humans. However, I don't have alignment in Dark Heritage, and I don't mean for the orcs and goblins to necessarily be monsters in the way that they are in D&D. And that actually fits quite well with Eberron too, where orcs and goblinoids are just people who are extraordinarily exotic in some way or another. So I have both. I have orcs and goblins. I don't have other goblinoids. I don't have hobgoblins, for example. I kind of have that's a very much a D&D affectation where there's a difference between orcs and hobgoblins, whereas conceptually, of course, they are based on literally the exact same thing. So I only have one. I have orc and I have goblin. We'll get to that later when I discuss how to translate Eberron into this. The next race I have is called Cursed, which I don't love the name anymore. I don't know that it fits quite as well in Eberron, but I haven't thought of another one yet. The Cursed are a very pale race, chalky, grayish-white skin, white hair, pale eyes, so pale that they look like silver chrome, raspy, whispering voices. I actually came up with this concept before I saw the 4th edition Shadar Kai, but visually they would look very similar, although my curse don't have weird tattoos and piercings and look like, pale punks. They're just a very, they're actually more, it's based on a totally different kind of thing. Cursed in Dark Heritage originally come from Lomar, and before that from Zabna. If you are a fan of certain of H.P. Lovecraft stories, those will sound familiar to you. And they were driven out of their homes by the Nofke, which were kind of like Sasquatches of the far north, and then later by the savage Inutos, whoever exactly they were supposed to have been. And they're kind of a race again that's very much like human, but they've lost their homeland. They're just primeval. H.P. Lovecraft did say in a letter to Clark Ashton Smith that he imagines that their homeland was either identical to or adjacent to Smith's own primeval Hyperborea story of sword and sorcery. And so that's where I kind of got the idea, although making them, kind of this pale, Morlock kind of looking creature was something that I added to it, and I thought that actually made sense for somebody who would have come from the very far north originally. But to me, it's just a racial characteristic. It doesn't have to. I'm actually going to translate as much as possible the backstory too into Eberron, but I've used them in a way that's maybe a little bit different. The next race I have is called the Jan. They have brick red skin, pale blonde hair, very pale and fiery, kind of sticks up and waves around in the wind by nature, and they have, bright yellow predator eyes. They are very similar in D&D terms to the Fire Genasi. So they would be humans, but they have a very distant ancestor who was an Efreet from the city of Brass. And so they kind of have, a lot of characteristics of fire kind of in their personality. They're very temperamental. They can't seem to hold still. I'll get to it later, but I've found the perfect place for them in Eberron, replacing one of the D&D races. The next race I have is called the Kemlings. They have sooty, dark gray or jet black, obsidian-colored skin. They also have shining yellow eyes, dark hair, and kind of a ring of jet black horns that grow out of their head, so it pokes out above their hair. So kind of imagine, I guess, visually a combination of Nightcrawler from the X-Men and Darth Maul. Or maybe imagine Grazit from, the Demon Lords, except with regular human legs instead of those weird goat legs. And I see them as, in some ways, the equivalent of the Kemlings. They have, obviously demonic ancestry at some point. Their counterpart is the Nephilim, which, coming from Judeo-Hebraic mythology as they do, you would obviously know that they are, touched by the blood of an angel of some kind. However, you would probably also notice that if they are going to have been the descendant of some angel, then by default it has to have been a fallen angel. So this is not necessarily, although they are very beautiful, they have very statuesque look. They usually have silver hair, chrome eyes, or golden eyes sometimes. Pale, but it's sort of metallic, almost bronzy skin. Very, very attractive looking people, but they kind of do have a tendency towards sociopathy if they don't watch out for it, because their ancestry includes sociopathic fallen angels. And then the last race I have is called the Woes, or the Woses, the Wood Woses. This is actually based on an ancient folkloric tradition of these kind of hairy men of the woods, but very curiously, that was influenced by the Tharn of Iron Kingdoms and by the Shifters of Eberron, and so conceptually they are exactly the same as the Shifters of Eberron already. Although I obviously gave them a different name and a different backstory, but they are also touched by the blood of werewolves, although that curse has lost its potency and they've just kind of become, a shadow of what an actual werewolf, would be. But without the curse, they don't actually, go savage and lose control and run around killing people like werewolves do either. But, obviously they don't have the same power as a werewolf does when a werewolf is in its, powerful shape-shifted form. They're just, hairy outdoorsman types. So those are the races that I have. Now I'm trying to think, what do I do with Eberron? I actually think that Eberron, in order to be Eberron, it's important to add the signature races of the setting. So I've already got Shifters, basically under another name. I have also added Kalashtar, Changelings, and Warforged, pretty much exactly as they are in the setting, because they kind of need to be there. You will notice, however, I don't have any elves or dwarves or halflings or gnomes, which many people would think would be a challenge. But I've decided that I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. So let's talk about the races that I don't have. Except I've been talking for longer than I thought already. Let's go do this very quickly. So I've decided I'm going to mostly use the Nephilim to replace elves and half-elves. Keep in mind, as I said in my last one, the elven nation of Valinar, and there's also Aranel, but I'm not really going to get off of Corvair very much. The elven nation of Valinar is not an elven nation, or it's not even a Nephilim nation. The Nephilim basically are just the ruling overcast of people who kind of run it, and at most they make up 10 to 15% of the population. The rest of the people there were the pre-existing human population that was already living there. Let's see, dwarves. I think that it's a little silly that the Maror holds have been basically, they've reskinned dwarves to be almost exactly the same as Swiss bankers and watchmakers. So why not just make them human? Because so Swiss bankers and watchmakers are human too, right? So I've decided that the dwarves will be replaced by just they're humans, and they're just a different nation who kind of stand apart from the other nations a little bit, and probably have a different genetic profile. I think the halflings, I think Keith Baker tried really hard to make the halflings cool, but he deviated so far from the concept of the halfling that it kind of begs the question of why make them halflings then? I know why he did, because it's a D&D setting and he had to. I've decided that the Jan actually fit here better, partly because I think the idea of halflings running around riding dinosaurs is kind of silly. I'd rather have a regular full-sized race doing that. But partly because I think they actually fit really well as kind of nomadic, somewhat savage raiders and bandits, but who also have integrated in fairly large degrees into the greater society of Corvair in general. Now, if halflings already weren't very cool, the gnomes were the halflings' even less cool, nebbish older brother, and trying to make them a nation of spies and gangsters is, again, if you're going to change gnomes that much, then don't use gnomes. I think gnomes were always a poor fit in D&D, and I never had much interest in them anyway. So I have decided that the Cursed are going to replace the gnomes. Yeah, sure, they came from the north originally, but now they are native to Zilargo, and they have other nations as well. In addition to, their backstory as, kind of refugees from a Holocaust of their nation up in the north. I'm also going to add just a little bit of kind of the Onyx coastlines of Inganok to Zilargo and kind of give them a little bit more of that kind of Lovecraftian vibe to them. hobgoblins. They have the nation of Dargoon, which they rule, and again, I only have orcs. I don't have orcs and hobgoblins, so I had to figure out, well, how do I split that? Orcs and goblins, in my opinion, go together. That's how Tolkien did it. That's how I'm going to do it, which means that hobgoblins in Eberron will be orcs in my system. So Eberron Remixed replaces all the hobgoblins with orcs. The orcs themselves, on the other hand, will be replaced by the Skraelings. So they will kind of be an ancient, somewhat autochthonous population that hides out far in the west, like shadow marches and whatnot, but also kind of linger in other places like the Moror holds a little bit, where they were able to kind of do their thing. I actually kind of like the idea of tying the fall of Atlantis with whatever's going on with the gatekeepers, and I'll get to that when I talk more about the organizations and the different regions. But I actually kind of like the idea of the Skraelings being the orcs and the orcs being the hobgoblins. Hopefully that's understandable. And then, like I said, Woses and Shifters, they're already the same thing, so I just changed the name. I actually don't care which name you use, but I prefer Shifter for Eberron, and I prefer Woes for Dark Heritage. And then Warforged, Kalistar, and Changelings I created as new races for my system and added them as well. So anyway, that's like I said, probably the most visual and first thing you'd notice kind of change for my remixing of Eberron. But I've got more to talk about, so I'll see you next time as we cover the next topic.